Live. Everywhere. On netrootsradio.com. David Waldman. Kagro. In the morning. Now, here's David Waldman.
Hey, good morning, everybody. How you doing? It is Thursday, October 6th, 2022. Time for another show. Time to, we're like, all atoned. I don't know. I probably still have some work to do on that. It never ends. But anyway, we're back on the air live today. That's great news. It's a little disorienting. Another one, a break in the middle of the week is always kind of disorienting, especially one like yesterday where, I don't know, the day seems like 15 days long. But, well, here we are. And, as we said, time for another show. It feels a little bit like a Friday. It feels a little bit like a Monday, coming back from a day off. And I would say it feels somewhat like a Thursday as well. What do you think? All right, well, it hardly matters because we will be reading you the stories that will dictate what kind of day it is and how you should be feeling from the news media and others. And you know how that goes in the United States of America. Okay, well, somehow when I said that, I was about this close to just saying "into the republic for which it stands," because I don't know, the United States of America came out very weird. Okay, let's see. Greg has a collection of stories ready to go already. It appears like they might even be a little bit Ukraine heavy, because maybe you lost sight of what was going on there, but it's big news. Big news elsewhere, lots of interesting articles to go over, and golly, a lot of material. How was your day yesterday? If you were fasting and spending your day at the temple, then welcome back. If you weren't and you were wondering where, I don't know, 10% of us or fewer, I guess, disappeared to yesterday. It's a very interesting thing. We had again, here, we'll start with the local news. Has having nothing to do with anything else in the world. But here in Loudoun County, where you have to listen to parents and yada yada something, the school system was closed for Yom Kippur as well as for Rosh Hashanah, and they're making an effort to close for a wider variety of holidays across many religions. I think there's a Diwali closing coming up, so we have a very large Indian American population here, so that makes a great deal of sense. It's probably even bigger than the Jewish population. I'm not positive of that, but it's nice to do all the different holidays and to give kids a chance to have the day off. And the kids don't mind. I don't know if some of the parents, the political parents, grumble. Oh, all these crazy religions that aren't even real or true and don't have Jesus in them. Why do we have days off for that? But the kids appreciate it. Kids love a day off, and quite honestly, they'll credit you for giving them a day off. Hey, thank God for the Jewish religion and Hinduism, because we get days off. It's great. It's fantastic. And sometimes then they learn about the day and the religion, but not all of the lessons sink in entirely. I did run into, as is usually the case, we still have work to do, lots of people saying, hey, why don't we schedule that thing that the kids need to do as a group for Wednesday because they're off from school. Yeah, we're off from school, but you know why? It's still an issue that parents are like, well, and teachers to some extent. It's a day off, so you should be able to do this or that, or you have an extra day to work on your homework because there's a day off. And it's like, it's not a day off for everybody. And okay, well, like I said, we still have work to do, and that will come around when we have off for Diwali, and all non-Hindus say, terrific, wonderful, let's do, and I already see that happening. But whatever. Okay, that I thought was of some interest. Down in Florida, to get more political, this is a good segue thing. I just happened to notice that. I wake up in the morning, I was not in Florida when I did it, and check the weather report, the weather app on the phone, and it serves up videos. I want to know what temperature it is. They want me to know that cars washed away in a hurricane. Show me a video of something like that. But one of the top video today was about schools being closed in Florida. Of course, the hurricane came through and in some cases wrecked the schools or wrecked your ability to get to the schools. And the schools are still closed in, I think, some 5-6 counties in central Florida with no plan for being able to reopen them because the damage there is that extensive, or the damage in the neighborhood is that extensive. And I'm just fascinated in watching headlines asking Governor DeSantis, the champion of reopening the schools right away after COVID or whatever, not able to reopen the schools in Central Florida. And, you know, I mean, it's only been a little while, to be fair, but I'm interested in seeing when are the schools going to reopen in Florida? Headlines like, yeah, what about that? When are you going to listen to parents? Throw out the in-party. They closed the schools. When's the parent revolution begin? Just curious, if you're in Florida, now is a good time to start it. It's funny and everyone will know what you mean. Might as well have some fun with it. Always good to throw a little bit of fun into your politics if you can. And to that end, Greg Dworkin, good morning. How are you?
We're doing just fine, thank you.
All right.
You know, yesterday was
fun.
a year long, which is why I felt that way.
Yes, well, it did. And you know what? I guess what makes time pass faster, food. That helps.
Well, that's the thing. You know,
Yeah.
you were talking about having an Indian population or a Jewish population in the area, or a Chinese or Asian population,
Oh.
really. And the most important thing about that is better food.
That's true. And
Not
as
only
I'm
that,
discovering,
you have the
Latin
side-
American as
side
well.
thing, not the most important thing, but the side thing of like if you're not Christian and you want to go out and eat on Christmas, there's a place
Right.
to go.
Right. Well, that's that was always the case, and the options are expanding. Latin American places not quite so generous in being open on Christmas, but that's fine. They can take the time. But that's a great addition to the cuisine around here as well. We got a real. That's what was great. I enjoyed the diversity of the area for a long time, and it was particularly comforting. Really, I'm bringing back a story to mind. Right after Trump's election, and there was that real feeling of, how far right/fascist are we going to swing here? And taking note of my neighbors and who they were, out at the mall food court, pretty much right after the election, and thinking, yeah, that's going to have a hard time taking root around here. That's good news. And we can all kind of watch out for each other. And we did. And it stayed blue here. So,
Well, the next thing I'm going to talk about is Liz Truss and a little bit about what's going on in England before we get to American politics.
English muffins, that's food.
Well, see, but one of the things that always struck me about, I don't understand how
cooking.
Brexit passed, is that over my adult lifetime, the food in England has gotten just so much better.
That's true, because
And
they bring it in
why would you want to go back?
from elsewhere. Yeah, boil everything. If they had been
take a beautiful
Right.
filet mignon and throw it in a pot and boil it before you serve it for dinner.
right. I mean, if it had
Why?
been Vindalexit, they wouldn't have gone for it.
So anyway,
They get it.
The concept that Brexit worked out just great is still very rampant among conservatives, among Tories.
Well, they like bad food.
And I came across a couple of interesting written things here. Of course, I was reminded of the very famous H.L. Mencken quote, which is true both there and here. And one of the reasons it's so important to look at there is because what happens there can happen here. But democracy is the theory that the common people know what they want and deserve to get it good and hard. And so nothing proves that more than Brexit.
Yeah. Yes. Indubitably.
So Brexit comes, and the UK economy goes, and the Tories are in trouble. And so what they do is they double down on everything. And I'm going to read a couple of pieces here. One is by Ross Clark in The Telegraph. The other's by Tim Stanley in The Spectator. But both of those authors actually write for both places. And they're both, good places to look to see,
right.
well, what are conservatives really thinking these days? Because as we know, Liz Truss was elected not by the country, but by Tories only to fill out the rest of Boris Johnson's term. She has to have a general election by January 2025, if not sooner. And so one of the first things she did is huddle up with her ministers, but not the rest of the party, certainly not the country, and decide that Reaganomics and Thatcherism was great, and let's just do it, and screw you if you don't like it. And she tried that, and the markets revolted. They found it revolting. They found her plans revolting. And so they revolted. And then she had to do a U-turn, so now she looks really weak. And then that's basically what's going on here. So this one piece, again, these are conservatives. These are her supporters. So this one from The Telegraph, Liz Truss has become another Theresa May. Last week, Truss and Kwarteng, that's her Chancellor of the Exchequer, whose idea it therefore was, and so he's the one that gets thrown under the bus when the times comes.
That's double-decker bus, too.
Seems set on setting a new course for the UK economy. Now they're rudderless, being blown about by the left. And when you read the piece, it's interesting because they basically defend supply-side economics and Brexit, just that, this was done terribly, one more than the other. This one, it's true that there's far too big a hole in government spending plans. No UK government has managed to balance the books for the past 2 decades, and the government seems to have abandoned any intention of achieving this, in contrast to the Cameron and Osborne era. But going back on a tax cut is the wrong way to go about it. What Kwarteng should have done instead is dump the absurd proposal to subsidize energy bills for the wealthy.
For the wealthy?
Yeah, for the next 18 months, the government will be chipping in to pay our gas and electricity bills, not just those of the poor, but billionaires who can well afford to heat their homes. Indeed, the bigger your home, the higher you like to turn up your thermostat, the bigger a public subsidy you will receive. And it says much about the current state of politics that these handouts for the rich have attracted far less negative comment than the proposal to reduce the high bracket tax rate. Big government, big taxes, big spending seem to be back in fashion. A week ago, Truss and Kwarteng seemed set on the taxation side on setting a new course, one which was unashamedly biased towards growth. In other words, he's still defending supply side. Instead, we find ourselves with a rudderless government being blown around by media opinion and the views of a few backbenchers, which is basically the Tories who are revolting and say we're going to get clobbered in the next election. Much more reminiscent of the Theresa May era than Mrs. Thatcher. Their proposal to abolish the high income tax rate may be gone, but the economic rocks are still very much around us. That was one of them. The other one says, Liz Truss's analysis of what's gone wrong and needs to be done is much to commend it, but the Conservatives, after 12 years of faffing about, have left the country disposed to pick redistribution, and I can't entirely blame them. One downside of the inept way we've managed capitalism, even with constant handouts, is gross inequality, which just goes to show that the conservatives there aren't nearly as conservative as the conservatives here. It unbalances society, feeding civil unrest that can promote money for money's sake, which is unpleasantly materialist, and it's just wrong that while the Tories can sign off on a high-income tax cut, they drag their feet over raising benefits. I'm against that tax cut because I think it's bad politics, but also because I don't want it. With the choir of Westminster Abbey still ringing in our ears, this might be the time to invest a little more in our people. And he brings the Queen into it in kind of an interesting way that I hadn't thought of.
She's retired.
To top it off, the late Queen died, a woman who stood for sacrifice and putting her country first, and Keir Starmer has brilliantly exploited these themes, making out that Elizabeth was a closet socialist. The Tories have failed to do the same, even though monarchy is the most conservative thing imaginable. We are not using her as a symbol, and they are. I can't stand it, he says.
That's a good point.
Pretty interesting.
Yeah.
So basically, the Tories are upset.
She's on the money.
Again, reading The Spectator is like reading Politico. It's kind of a gossip sheet for what conservatives are thinking. Liz Truss had a recent conference with her conservatives. And instead of being like a national Republican convention or a CPAC where everybody congratulates each other for being wonderful, Liz Truss was downgraded and rebelled against and holed up in a room trying to figure out how to appease people. It was just awful, awful stuff for them. And part of the problem is they can't admit that the underlying principles where they stand, which is to say for Brexit and for supply-side economics, are awful policy. But the bigger part of it, of course, just like our conservatives, is they're much more concerned about power than they are about principle, is that they fear a wipeout in the next election. So I was trying to think of an analogy to try to, put it in my head as to what's going on. And there aren't any good ones here because it's really not quite the same system. But it would be as if Joe Biden had to retire, let's say for health reasons. And so the president is now Vice President Kamala Harris, who was not elected by the country. And because she wasn't elected, the opposition feels like they are free to really attack as much as possible. This unelected person is doing this, that, and everything else. And in response to that, Kamala Harris decides, whether you think it's a good idea or not, to adopt Bernie Sanders' entire economic program, or Elizabeth Warren's.
All right.
And they're going to push it with executive order because they don't have the votes.
Okay.
All right. So then
what
happens is that the Joe Manchins in West Virginia and, the Kirsten Sinemas and Mark Kelly's in places like Arizona, which are swing states, say, this is a terrible idea. I can't sell this to my constituents. And Harris says, well, too bad, we're doing it anyway.
Okay.
And whatever happens in the midterms. Right? And so what do you think is going to happen in the midterm? People like Manchin, if he were up, would lose, and people like Sinema, if she were up, would lose. Yeah. And they'd lose everything. And so, good idea, bad idea, should be done, shouldn't be done. You can't just all of a sudden start pushing things that your constituents don't want in what they call the marginal districts for the backbenchers. Because it's going to have political ramifications. And so, again, it's not that Harris would do that. I'm just saying, here's a theoretical.
It's not that she's
and if you do that, you're going to lose the swing voters in all of the purple states. And if you lose all of the purple states, if you lose the independents, you're out of power. That's what the backbenchers who are not in the cabinet fear, and that's why there's a revolt no matter what Liz Truss does. Now they don't trust her. They don't think her political judgment is keen. They don't believe anything she says because she changes her mind. And they don't believe anything that she might say about how this is ultimately going to be good for your constituency and help you win, because they're watching her flail about. And so, that's why there's probably going to be an election well before January 2025, lots of no confidence votes and rebellion about anything she suggests from now on. And, that's how parties that think they have everything and have a mandate to do stuff and overreach, that's how they fall, little by little.
Okay. Yeah, I think I see what we were getting at there. People will object, but you had to reverse the roles here because we don't have the conservative in power here. But I see what you mean. It would certainly be the concern of conservative-leaning Democrats or Democrats in swing states that they were being forced to adopt the Bernie Sanders
you're going to
agenda.
Kill us.
Yeah.
The Tim Ryans.
Oh. I could see where that would be the case, and so it's the mirror image of what's going on. Of course, we have the inclination to say, well, what's wrong with Elizabeth Warren's program? No, you don't see.
But if you're going to have a very close election, this is not something you necessarily want to push the day before the election.
Certainly there will be people who are running for office who will say, yeah, I don't want to. And you know who they are, and they may be wrong, but they may be right for their district, wrong for the country, but that's their concern.
And you can't have policy without politics. So, if you lose the majority, that's what happens. And that's what's happening in Georgia. We all know that Herschel Walker's in deep trouble as a human being. And we know that he's not qualified to be in the Senate. And you look and you say, well, how is it that it's even a close race? And the answer is very clear. Dana Loesch and the other conservatives have made it very clear. I don't really care about anything. Yeah. I just want control of the Senate. I mean,
he will campaign out of the box, or from the box, and he'll govern that way too. He's got an R, pull the lever. That's what they're saying.
So I think he'll lose, but I think he'll lose because he's going to lose Roy Moore style. He's not going to collapse. But what will happen is that just enough people at the last minute will say, I can't do this. And they'll either not fill out. They'll vote for Brian Kemp, but they'll not fill out a Senate vote. Or I don't think they're going to vote for Warnock, although they like Warnock. That's not the point. But I just don't think there's going to be. They'll vote for a third party. I just don't think that there's going to be enough votes for Herschel Walker to get across the finish line. But it's not that he's going to. He's going to get his 45 or 46.
Yeah. All right.
But I just don't think he'll get 51.
Yeah.
So he's still claiming that all of these are lies. And Roger Solenberger, who wrote the story in the Daily Beast, confirms the report himself and says he spoke to Herschel Walker. Herschel Walker never asked for a correction. And the campaign could just have him pull up his bank statements and see for themselves. And the other thing, of course, that Sullenberger said is that, the really weird thing about this whole story is that there were rumors of Herschel Walker being involved with abortions, but not this case, not this one. So maybe there were others. But in the meantime, last night he said, we know who this person is because it's the mother of one of his kids.
Yes, this is
who's willing to go on the record now.
I don't think we got to this yesterday because yesterday was pre-recorded, so it's been a while. So we missed a day, and this is the Herschel Walker paid for an abortion at some point. One of his girlfriends, and
and the receipts. The receipts
he said,
of him paying for the abortion.
I don't know who
Herschel
this
Walker
person
sent her a
is.
get well card with his signature. And when asked, did he do that? He said, I don't know. I sent a lot of people a lot of money and the
a lot of abortions.
And a lot of cards. And so how many abortions have you had? He had to
I didn't even know there were abortion
sending people
cards.
get well cards and all this and that and everything else.
Be.
Then his son, Christian Walker, who was a conservative influencer on TikTok and other places, just blasted him for lying.
Oh, wow.
And so that probably had more impact than the Daily Beast story because of the people who it would affect. The people who read the Daily Beast already aren't voting for him.
Yeah.
But the people who watch TikTok and look at conservative influencers heard this for the first time. And so you couldn't say, well, it's fake news. Well, our conservative people are saying it's real news. And then the reaction in Georgia is that Brian Kemp and the other Georgian Republicans are distancing themselves from him, even though the national Republicans are backing him to the hilt because they have no choice. They can't get him off the ballot. It's too late. And like Dana Loesch, the only thing they care about is getting the Senate. They don't care who's in that seat. So, he's a flawed candidate, and all of this is going on. And so how do we know how it's going? It's too soon. We try to look at polls. You can't because they're just not relevant enough. They're not soon enough. And besides, we have a whole issue with polls anyway, which is my next segment. But, as far as we know, what's happening now, the latest polls for the Senate actually have Warnock leading. The aggregate has him up by about 4 points. The Insider Advantage poll from October 4th has him up by 4 points. And in fact, that one poll started polling and then this whole story broke. So they pulled a poll and then they redid it so that their entire sample would be after the news came out. And it went from Warnock +1 to Warnock +4. Okay. So there's, again, in a very close race, it matters. That poll showed Warnock 47, Walker 44. Survey USA had a ridiculous poll that had Warnock 50 and Walker 38. When you look at a poll like that, the first thing you think of is, okay, that means that the Republicans were so upset about what was going on, they're not answering. That would be the only explanation for why it's that big.
Yeah.
Fox News poll, Warnock up by 5. I mean, it's a race I think Warnock is going to win anyway. But
yeah, it was looking pretty good.
We really need to wait a little bit to see what the impact is going to be when the more recent polling comes out.
Okay, it's not much more time to wait, though.
Well, but we have another week. So horse race and that poll and that race is going to be polled not only because it's close, not only because it's key, but because this big news happened and everybody wants to know, well, what kind of effect did it have? So, in that regard, I came across this by a National Review conservative writing on Twitter, which I thought was pretty interesting. His name is Nate Hockman. I don't know if you follow him or not.
Another Nate?
I don't. It's a third Nate.
Sounds like a fake
every
name.
time I do reporting, he writes, that requires talking to normal voters outside the Beltway, I'm reminded of just how ideologically incoherent the average American is. It's a good reminder of why attempts to explain mass political trends in terms of elite left or right ideology are so silly. And when I read that, the first thing I read or thought of is, okay, these are the Republicans who claim that all the crime ads we're doing are really going to win the election for Republicans, just like the caravans.
Yeah,
won it for Ed Gillespie.
They love those. True, right?
I'm down in South Texas, he says. This third Nate, for the week to report on Latino voting trends here and talking to random people in cantinas, stores, etc., rather than political activists. Everybody's completely impervious to my desperate attempt to fit them into predetermined ideological frameworks.
Okay.
The most politically engaged segments of both the left and right have these perfectly formulated explanations for why Latinos should vote. Intersectionality, multiracial solidarity, free marketers, pro-life Catholics, whatever you want to pick.
All right.
Aspects of both these messages probably do have some truth, but the absurdity of attempts to explain, say, their move toward the GOP in terms of ideological conservatism, something I'm often guilty of doing, is immediately apparent once you start talking to actual voters. As an aside, you also realize how ideologically incoherent the nature of the two-party system is. Voters who, by any elite definition, are conservative are fiercely loyal Democrats. A Latina woman I talked to at a gas station here told me she goes to Catholic Mass 3 times a week as opposed to abortion in all circumstances and will never vote for Republicans.
Yeah, that's not ideologically inconsistent.
I've talked to voters in the past who are hardcore partisan Republicans and describe themselves as feminists, pro-choice. The normal American's voting habits are so much more instinctive and visceral than those of us who opine about politics for a living often imagine. So I just want to be clear here. None of it's meant as a pejorative. Speaking as an avowed political addict, I think it's sort of beautiful how politically complicated people are. And that's why, for example, when you read that, well, inflation is the most important thing, what does it mean? Does that tell you who people are going to vote for? No, it does not. Why is it so much more important than everything else? Because both Democrats and Republicans care about it, whereas abortion motivates Democrats and crime motivates Republicans.
Yes, true. All right.
More after the break. But, it's great.
It.
It's interesting. It doesn't tell you how the vote's going to go.
No.
Well, let's buy some ads and make some ads about it, because look at the polls.
Yeah, buy some on this show.
And buy them from me, because I'm a professional that sells ads.
Well, yes, there's always that. Okay. Well, we'll be right back with more. Hi, it's me, David Waldman, the same guy who was just talking to you a second ago. Our Patreon subscription drive is still going strong, with over 175 monthly donors who help keep us on the air. If we've helped keep you going during the pandemic, why not return the favor and help us keep going so we can all be together for the next disaster? Patreon.com, Patreon.com, makes it easy to make secure, recurring monthly contributions to support our show. Patreon.com/KagroX gets you straight to our donation page. Maybe you'd like to thank us for keeping you sane during the Trump era. Maybe you're looking forward to in-depth explanations of what's going on in the Biden administration. Whatever it is that keeps you listening, we need your help to keep bringing it to you. And hey, if you happen to prefer using PayPal or even the Square Cash app, we're up and running with those options too. Thanks again, everyone, for all your support. We literally could not do this without you. All right, welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. We have more. We said we did. I hope we do, because we promised. Good.
So I want to add one thing to the Herschel Walker thing, and I'm trying to learn a little bit about what happened with Doug Jones and Roy Moore.
Okay.
I'm old enough to remember it. You may be old enough to remember it. But Roy Moore was running against Doug Jones in Alabama.
Yeah.
And everybody said, well, Jones can't win because he's a wonderful person and everybody in Alabama loves him and they hate Roy Moore, but Roy Moore's a Republican. So, Doug Jones can't win. And it turns out Doug Jones did win.
Yes.
But part of the problem for Roy Moore is that all this stuff came out about his admiration of young girls.
Yeah, sure.
And that wasn't good for his electoral prospects. No, it wasn't good, for the country. It wasn't good for, anybody.
So he needed to be courting people of voting age.
He wound up losing the election. And so the question I had is, well, how did that – in other words, Roy Moore didn't collapse all at once. What is it that really made Republicans ultimately shy away, leave the Senate race blank, not vote? What was going on there? And it's hard to really pin down exactly – which constituency wound up pulling away from Roy Moore or why. But one of the things that stands out
mall owners
is not just the repetition, because, adults learn by repetition. Let me say that again. It's that it didn't happen all at once, but then there was a big hit at the very end. And the big hit at the very end was by Senator Shelby.
Yeah.
A Democrat turned Republican when the Dixiecrats disappeared.
Yes.
Okay. And I think it was the last week of the election. And he went on the Sunday shows and said, I can't vote for Roy Moore. I just can't.
That sounds familiar.
Do you remember that?
Clear as day.
And it was
rings
enough
bells, certainly. Yeah.
so that Roy Moore lost.
That'll do it.
And I'm looking at Georgia and thinking, where's the Roy Moore of Georgia this year? And things haven't changed that much. It wasn't that long ago. Unlike the national Republicans, the Georgia Republicans are distancing themselves. And like Roy Moore, what if other stories then start coming out, which they're likely to do?
I mean, I guess so.
Because Herschel Walker is Herschel Walker. And so what happens then? Do they say, I can't vote for this guy? Does somebody prominently say that who's not running in Georgia? Or some else, in the South, or some other prominent Republicans say that? It's possible. The Todd Akins of the world back in the day, Clara McCaskill reminds us, were deserted by the party. Now, Herschel Walker will never be deserted by the National Party because that has changed. But I'm just wondering, what the locals will do, and what the locals will do matters a whole lot more than what the national folks do.
Yeah, there's no Republican senator, an equivalent like Shelby, to say, yeah, I just can't do it because they want.
Shelby should come on and say, I couldn't possibly.
That's true. And that's because I live
Herschel
in the wrong
Walker
state.
any more than I could vote for Roy Moore. I mean, that's right.
And he could say that. And I vote in Georgia all the time because I am a vote fraudster.
I want to prove that vote fraud exists. So
but I don't know. I mean, I guess Brian
Kemp
could say it.
Just looking for somebody, but so
there
far
won't
it's not
be one.
happening.
I think,
it may not happen, and because it may not happen,
might be it.
Herschel Walker, may dwindle just enough to lose rather than collapse, which won't happen.
Okay, well, that's
so we'll look at the polls and we'll see what they say. But here's the thing about polls.
Yeah.
Okay, they don't work.
Oh. Well,
at least not the way people
doing
want them to work
all this time. All right.
This is Natalie Jackson writing in National Journal. She's great, and she's a polling expert. She does the PRRI poll, and she's been doing this for a long time. Horse race polls are not fixable. That's the title of the article. Likely voter screens are useful, educated guesses at what might happen, but we don't know who will vote, and we can't change that. We talked about that the other day in terms of looking not at likely voter, but likely electorate. That's what we want to know. Who's going to show up? And the specials tell us
that's what they meant.
That the likely voter screens don't work because they didn't pick up the surge for Democratic voters. So she writes, the biggest problem with horse race polling isn't fixable. The entire concept of polling depends on having a set population from which one can take a random sample and get a generally representative snapshot. Pre-election polls have no existing population. The election hasn't happened, and so voting isn't compulsory, and you don't know who that population you're pulling from really is. So we don't have a population of who voted until all the polls have closed. It's the only poll that counts.
I guess.
Right? So we can't remedy that. The population of voters will never exist prior to the election. Expecting is like Schrodinger's uncertainty principle and, Schrodinger's cat.
Right.
Is the cat alive or dead? Well, you only know by opening the box, but until then, you don't know. And it doesn't exist. It's in a state of either or. Expecting polls to be able to consistently, accurately predict an election is asking more than is statistically and theoretically possible. We've said this all the time.
Yes.
Polling is snapshot. Polling gives you an idea of why people do what they do and how they think. And, if you poll a group of people and say, I was going to vote for this guy, but now I'm not, and it's because of this, you've learned something. That still doesn't tell you who's going to win. Accurately predict an election is asking more than statistically and theoretically possible. Yes, we pollsters have a lot of information from past elections, but it's gotten harder to poll a representative sample of the entire American adult population. Just in the past couple of election cycles, we've seen candidates activate people who typically don't vote. That would be Donald Trump. So is it really surprising that the error rates of horse race polls have increased? Still, polls are the best way we have to gauge public opinion around elections, and that's a valuable tool. So the way pollsters have worked around this is to dip our toes into the prediction game by identifying likely voters. Those people we think will turn out. Let's be clear, though. Likely voters are educated guesses, and most public pollsters don't really say how they construct the models. But in general, there's three ways. Use information from voter registration files about who turned out to vote in the past. That's extremely accurate, but doesn't tell you about the voter who just registered.
Okay.
Or who doesn't usually vote but is motivated to vote now because of Roe Dobbs.
Or is 18.
Ask voters one or more questions about whether they plan to vote. In other words, trust the voter to be honest, or their enthusiasm about voting.
No, I know there's a clip about that somewhere.
Enthusiasms.
There you go.
This thing sits in the way of, all right, complaint about the physical layout. Go ahead.
But anyway, the thing is that people lie about their intent. So only about 85% of people who say they'll absolutely positively or that I already did actually do or did.
Okay. I won't bother with the liar clip, though.
Right.
Too long.
Or the third way is to create a model of what the expected electorate should look like and weight the data to that model. And they each have their pluses and minuses, but that's what they're doing. That's how you construct the likely voter.
Okay.
Okay.
So
75% or higher turnout would be record shattering. And the Marist poll shows that 75 to 77% of eligible state residents are definite voters. And Fox News polls found 82 to 87% of registered voters said they're certain to vote. But since that would be record setting, that's not likely to happen. So some of those people aren't telling the truth.
They're liars.
But that's better than just doing anything or doing nothing.
Yes.
And so you have to use the polls, and they give you a sense of what's going on, and looking at trends within a poll are good, but they still don't predict. And that's why nobody knows nothing about who's actually going to win.
Okay.
And you have to say that before you then go back and look at stuff. I mean, here's an example of where it does tell you something. Here's Detroit News. And this, our friend Taniel made a list of local elections that really matter, and this was top of his list back in July.
Okay.
Michigan voters favor abortion voting rights. Proposal 3, the high-profile ballot question that would establish a constitutional right to abortion, state constitution, overturning a old law that banned it that isn't being honored right now, garnered 61% support among likely general election voters. And we know who likely voters are. But with 61%, you can afford a little, okay, maybe it's this way, maybe it's that way. And support for the measure, and this is where polling helps you, support for the measure cut across gender, religious, and partisan lines. Most male and female voters who identify as lean Republican planning to vote yes. 1 in 3 voters who identify as strong Republican in favor of the constitutional amendment. So it's a very popular thing. Remember, the Republicans, through who controls the gavel, one of their committees, tried to block this from even being on the ballot because they said it had too many spaces in the application or something stupid like that. And they were overturned by the Michigan Supreme Court, which is why court elections are so important for voting rights.
Yep.
So I wanted to get all that in. But nonetheless, it's a good indicator that just like in Kansas, this matters in a lot of ways that in this case show up in the polls. But then if you ask, well, who's going to win the gubernatorial race, which is a different question, then you have to.
Voters are complex.
Well, yeah, then you have to interpolate one to the other. Now, it turns out that Gretchen Whitmer has a big lead at this particular point in time, but there'll be 2 debates, and we'll see what happens.
Yeah.
Will the debate change any minds? Well, people aren't changing their minds about this abortion issue.
Probably not. We've been fighting that one for a while.
So if you come out and vote, are you going to change your vote based on what happens in the 2 debates? Not likely. And, debates are good. They're fun, but, they don't usually change minds.
Yeah, I mean, I guess maybe on some smaller bore issue that people haven't thought about. But
when you have a 13 or 14-point lead, it's really not going to make the difference unless you completely collapse.
All right. Tudor Dixon should see if someone wants to kidnap her and see if that helps.
Well, making fun of kidnapping. And by the way, there's another trial going on right now. The federal trial resulted in convictions of people who tried to kidnap Gretchen Whitmer.
Yeah.
But now there's a state trial about aiders and abettors.
Oh, okay.
That's going on right now, which is different than the federal trial. Different people, different venue, state level. And so it's going to be in the news. I mean, so she's going to win.
I guess so. Good. Well, that's not to say anybody should go out there and concoct plans about kidnapping. Just
right. And because I have to leave early in my usual 20-minute segment, I'm just going to run down some recent polls from 538, but I wanted to talk about, grain of salt stuff first, which I did.
So these polls
ending
don't work.
October 4th.
Yes.
Insider advantage, Warnock Walker, Warnock by 4, Survey USA, Warnock Walker, Warnock by 12. U.S. Senate Arizona, Kelly Masters, Kelly by 3, CBS News. U.S. Senate Ohio, Ryan over Vance by either 8 or 11, depending upon whether you're looking at registered or likely voters, by Center Street PAC.
But they're not likely. Yeah.
And my favorite, North Carolina, Survey USA, Beasley 42, Budd 43. That's the sleeper race in my view. North Carolina is a very difficult race, like Ohio, structurally for Democrats to win. But this is an awfully close race. It stayed close. And like Tim Ryan, Sherry Beasley's a fantastic candidate, probably the best you can run in that state. And Ted Budd's mediocre. J.D. Vance is awful. So that's why Tim Ryan has a chance in Ohio. He's up by 11 or 8 in that Center Street PAC poll. Even if he's not up that much, he has a chance to win, and so does Beasley in North Carolina. So don't sleep on those sleeper races.
Okay, I will take that under advisement, and I probably won't sleep at all.
In fact, here's a good piece by Chris Smith in Vanity Fair: Why Democrats have a good shot at North Carolina's open Senate seat. Sherry Beasley is in a dead heat against Republican Ted Budd, giving Democrats renewed hope that in a high-stakes Senate race that has gone under the radar this midterms, she might win. North Carolina for Democrats is like New Jersey for Republicans. It looks close, it looks close, it looks close. You never get there. So at the same time, this may be the time you actually do. See Arizona.
It's extraordinary times, and people don't like candidates whose name is like 45% D's. That's my theory.
Simon Rosenberg writes that it's a good week of politics and polling for Democrats. The weekly tracks show Democratic gains. Politico Morning Consult, the Dems picked up 1 in the generic tracking. YouGov +2 since their last poll. Reuters +4 since their last poll. Morning Consult +1 since their last poll. Rasmussen +1 since their last poll. So all of them, except for Rasmussen, showed the Democrats leading by anywhere from 1 to 5 points. And Rasmussen has them trailing by 1, but still improving their situation. And still time. So a lot of the write-ups you'll see from the professional pundits is, well, the Democrats look to be okay now, but there's a lot of time for Republicans to make gains.
There's not, but okay.
And they also never write, but there's a lot of time for Democrats to consolidate and improve their position even more.
That's true, too.
And the reason they don't say that is because they're in Washington talking to professional consultants from both parties. And Republican consultants always think they're going to win. We've said this over the years. And Democratic consultants are always cautious and nervous and think they might lose. It's just in the DNA. And so, well, if we're looking at the body language of the parties, obviously Republicans are the one who feel they're in good position. Look at inflation, look at crime, but we talked about that. That's what's important to Republicans, but not necessarily important to everybody. And it doesn't mean that, you're going to vote on that. Yes, it's important to me. I don't like it. Maybe I blame OPEC.
Wow, you'd be an elderly person.
Well, they just raised their price on oil, so it's going to be all over the news.
OPEC, okay. Yeah, all right. Well, sure. It's been a while since I've felt confident in blaming OPEC for anything.
Yeah, well, just wait.
Sure.
That's going to be
Venezuela's
the
in
sticker
OPEC
shock
now.
because the Saudis just decided to decrease, to support Russia and decrease output.
Okay.
And, that's going to be a big deal. But because it's going to be a big deal, it's going to be talked about. And because it's going to be talked about, you have somebody to blame, and this is politics, and so we'll see what happens.
Then we all buy electric cars.
Yeah, but, that's another day.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Hasn't happened yet.
That's what's going on.
Okay.
At least since the last time I was on the show. And
right.
This is Thursday, so I'll see you Monday, right?
It's the last time you're on the show for the week.
Last time I'm on
Monday,
the show today.
Right? Yeah. So that's what you think. I'm going to call you. Okay. Well, very interesting, especially the segment about the shakiness of we have to keep that in mind. And then, of course, we read all the polls, and that was the grain of salt, as you said.
What somebody said at the last election, this is the time of year for the polar coaster.
Okay.
So the polar coaster makes you feel great because you just saw a poll that says you guys are ahead. And then 3 hours later, you see this other one where this other guy is behind. And so your emotions go up and down based on the latest poll. And that's the polar coaster. Okay. Welcome to the polar coaster.
That's a good term. You can write a book on that one. I'm going to reserve Polar Express for a little later in the season.
Mm-hmm.
And then something. Pole
anyway,
dancing.
Take care, and I'll talk to you on Monday.
Very good. Okay. And we'll have some questions for you then. I'll see if I can remember them over the weekend. Thanks, Greg. Appreciate it. I know you got to run. You just ran. That's how we can tell. So I'll pose the questions now so that everybody has a chance to think about them. He had to leave the show. That doesn't necessarily mean he had to stop listening, but I'll repeat the questions. No, I won't. I'll forget between now and then. The questions I had about that whole segment on likely voter screens. I understand how difficult that would be to come up with a good screen because, guessing at the reasons that people who might not vote either would or wouldn't decide to vote, that seems very difficult to predict. If you're not a dedicated voter who has voted in every election and just says, out of habit, you're going to do it, then it's tough to guess, particularly with people who, have been eligible to vote and registered to vote for a long time, but aren't absolutely reliable voters. And just like you were saying, it's difficult, just as it's difficult to predict from certain other factors how people are going to vote. I'm a conservative Catholic who goes to Mass 3 times a week and is strongly opposed to abortion, but I am Latino, and so therefore have decided I'm never going to vote in favor of Republicans. And of course, there's millions of Latinos who have said, I kind of will, but you get the idea. So it's difficult to predict that sort of thing. It's similarly difficult to predict what would motivate somebody who's fully capable of voting and eligible and registered and everything, and might even keep up their registration and never vote. Hard to tell whether that, this year they'll be motivated, and it may have something, maybe they're retired now and they have time on their hands, or their schedule has changed and so it's not as difficult to get to the polls after all. And so, hey, what the hell? Or maybe they really care about something. And how can you guess which one of the things it is that's going to motivate them? But here's my other question. So I had 2 general questions about the likely voter screen, and one is political science question, and one is a philosophical question. Starting with the political science question, because it's a good brass tacks thing. You mentioned that, one of the problems is, of course, the voter pool is an empty set right now because we haven't held the vote, and voting's not mandatory. Struck a chord with me. There are places where voting is, it's said to be mandatory, and I don't know how mandatory it really is, but Australia comes to mind every time. Now, Australians can tell me what that really means about voting being mandatory. I think the law is on the books that they can, hit you with a cricket bat maybe if you don't vote, but maybe they just don't do it. Like a lot of things are supposedly mandatory here in the United States. Paying your taxes, for instance, supposedly mandatory, and yet the previous president of the United States never did that. So how mandatory is it? Now, you'll get in trouble, but he loves trouble, so who knows? Right. So I guess there's some question about how mandatory it is. But I would say for political science purposes, it's probably mandatory enough that you could ask the question, or should ask the question, or somebody has already probably asked the question, because there's a lot of political scientists out there, and they're very busy people, and they have to vote, or they have to work and produce work all the time, publish. So, all right, Greg's still listening. Sent me something on Australia. Is that how? Maybe something about how mandatory it really is. But shouldn't it be possible to say how do likely voter screens do in Australia versus in terms of predictive value versus here in the United States where it's not mandatory? Is there any difference? And that should tell you something about your likely voter screens and whether or not they're useless here. If they're of use in Australia, then there's something to it, and maybe you keep striving to refine your likely voter screen. I don't know. I don't know what you do with the results, but it sounds like an interesting study. And really, isn't that what it's all about? For a political scientist, you can spend time, a lot of time, your whole life, studying things that in the end you say, well, I've reached a conclusion, but I don't know what to do with it, and I don't know if it means anything in real life. Any scientist can do that, political or otherwise. Secondly, the philosophical question, as the Schrodinger's cat scenario came up, and you don't know until you open the box, etc. But because, and again, this is just a philosophical question. I don't know if there's as much political science application here, although it might help you try and understand likely voters a little bit more. Schrodinger's cat as a philosophical question changes to some extent if opening the box is an eventuality, a surety. Like, you know that on November, whatever it's going to be this year, 8th, I don't remember, the box is going to open. You know, and people are going to find out, well, for one thing, there's going to be a record of whether or not you voted, but that's not really in people's calculus because they don't care. But it's an interesting thing. Just like I said, it's a purely philosophical question maybe, and not political science. Purely philosophical in the sense that, well, we don't know whether the cat is there or not, or even exists or not. And the only way to find out is to open the box. And prior to opening the box, you know, there's this difficulty in determining the answer to any of these questions. But it does change things, or it will change people's perceptions about things, or whether they'll, I guess if you were polling people on whether or not they thought there was a cat in there, given that there's a date certain on which the box will definitely be opened, people will begin to change their answers, right? Like, it doesn't matter that much. If you were to poll people, is there a cat in there or not? And that's not the problem that was being posed. But if you were to cross those two problems together, is there a cat in there or not? If there was no certainty that the box would ever be opened, I think maybe people would, well, how would people feel about giving an answer? I don't know, but what the hell? I feel compelled to give an answer. All right, then yes, there's a cat in there, or no, or they'd shake the box. There was a cat in there, but now the cat is dead or unconscious. I don't know if that matters. Whereas if the box is definitely going to be open, there will be an answer. Maybe this is a question about pollsters in general. How will you form your likely voter screen, knowing that there will be an answer that will prove you right or wrong at the end? And then they start sweating the details and trying to hammer out a likely voter screen instead of saying, we don't know. But so two interesting crossover questions in that, but maybe interesting to nobody. I don't know. Greg's still sending me messages, so it must be of interest to him. Let's see what he sent, so maybe we can puzzle some of this out for ourselves, or see if we can predict what he might say about this on Monday. All right. What has he sent me here? It's funny. This is a picture from The Guardian. Accompanying this article, will Australia's opinion polls be more accurate in 2022 than at something? We'll get to, so maybe they've already asked this question. And it's Australians, a photo of Australians, I guess, at Australian voting booths. You can tell they're Australian voting booths because they are upside down. And, my initial scan, my eyes going, maybe this is Yom Kippur talking, but it looked like I thought this is people at the Wailing Wall. No, they're at a wall of voting booths. They're next to one another. It's like one solid wall of voting booths with little partitions. So everybody's standing more or less shoulder to shoulder, but with their head leaning in. So anyway, it's the Australian Wailing Wall. What do we have here? How compulsory voting works. Here's Australians Explained. And we'll take explaining this thing. This is the New York Times from maybe way back, October 2018. And there's a picture of many Australians plus what looks to be like a sausage sandwich of some kind, which, I mean, honestly, that would probably improve voting here. Like, if you get one sausage sandwich free with voting, that would probably do it for most Americans. Our readers from Australia, the New York Times readers, shared their thoughts about being required to vote and helped explain the ins and outs of the process. As I said, it's not a brand new story or anything. They just asked Australians last time they voted, maybe. The dirty work of democracy is often compared to the making of sausages. I hope that's not the extent of the explanation for why there's a sausage there. I'm really holding out for the free sandwich. But Australians almost take that maxim literally, turning Election Day into a countrywide barbecue. Oh, good. There really is food involved, in which the grilling of hot dogs is optional, but voting is compulsory. And I hope that wasn't a hot dog, because it looked like a good sausage, bad hot dog. Like if your hot dog is that gray, don't cook it. Get a new one. Anyway, more than 96% of eligible Australians are enrolled to vote. That's good, but enrolled is not doing the deed here. Of those, more than 90% typically turn out, there's the real answer, to cast ballots for a federal election, far more than the 55% of eligible Americans who participated in the 2016 presidential election. Australians are induced to vote with both sticks and carrots, and maybe even literally, like if you were like more into veggie burgers than hot dogs. It could, in fact, be carrots. And quite honestly, if you've some of those meatless patties from the old days that I had might be as much sticks as anything else. Anyway, Australians induced to vote with both sticks and carrots, some with dip, some without. Shirkers can be fined up to nearly $80 Australian if they fail to show at the polls. So there's something to it. Anyway, maybe more to the point, I'll scan it over the break here, but there's some indication that there's writing on whether or not that actually helps with the polling. They really should. Anyway, someone should look into that and what they're eating over there. As mentioned here at the end of this paragraph, voting, which always takes place on a Saturday, that's also helpful, is made easy and efficient and is often accompanied by community barbecue that includes eating what locals affectionately call democracy sausages. I don't know if I love that term, but we'll stick with it. All right, welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Networks Radio. Let's see. Shall we just, now I've opened this line of inquiry, like the box, and there is a cat in it, just in case you wanted an update. I thought I would take a look at the question of not so much how compulsory voting works. I now get some sense of it. The turnout works pretty good. You can be fined, plus there's barbecues. That's enough, I think, to understand. What about will Australia's opinion polls be more accurate in 2022 than at the last election, which I guess already implies that they did a poor job in the 2018 election, in which voting was mandatory and there were fines and there were hot dogs. So they blew it anyway? Is that what I'm reading? Polling companies have introduced new techniques, which means that they think their old techniques effed up, which answers the question even more, since they failed to predict Scott Morrison's 2019 election win. Or it's evidence of massive fraud, which, why not? Let's just claim that. There's massive fraud probably about the contents of those hot dogs, so there might as well be. Anyway, now they anxiously await to see if they have worked. I guess the new kinds. What's up here? Every major opinion poll failed to predict Scott Morrison's re-election in 2019, but once again, news organizations have run numerous stories based on polls in the current campaign. Sounds like they have the same problems we do, but upside down, including some that point to dramatic results nationally and in specific seats. By the way, if Scott Morrison tears up presidential notes and throws them in the toilet and flushes, goes the other direction. Australia. In 2019, let's see, the results sent shockwaves through the polling industry and kicked off a period of reflection, innovation, and transparency. And I suppose he'd be flushing prime minister notes down the toilet anyway. Pollsters now promise greater rigor, with a U, and have deployed some new techniques, but they have also urged voters to think differently about what polls can tell them. So, what weight can we lay on the opinion polls as the election approaches. I mean, I'm somewhat interested in this, but I guess it answers the question if mandatory voting, well, no, I guess it doesn't answer the question fully, but I was going to say if the polling methodologies are both the same, and it may turn out to be the same, and in which case it does answer the question. But do Australian pollsters do likely voter screens or don't they? Why not? Like, why would you? I'd throw that out the window, right? If 90% of eligible voters are going to show up anyway, you still have 10% to deal with. They must do something. But if they don't, then it's no help to you. Or if they do, let's find out what they do. I don't know if they will tell us what their methodology is, but something else to parse into. Plus, there's a guy with a funny name here, so we'll go on first. It's Australia, so there's going to be that. What went wrong in 2019? Murray Goot, spelled like boot, but with a G, an emeritus professor of politics and a leading polling expert, believes one problem was that the polling companies herded together behind a Labour victory, as the risk of being the lone fool was much greater than being one of many fools. Okay, that's interesting. You can see how that would happen psychologically. Look, my polling is saying that it's a tight race, but it looks like Morrison will be reelected. And then you look around and nobody else is saying that. And you say, well, it looked like technically it said he would win by 1 point. That could be statistical noise. All my previous polls said he was going to lose. Everybody is now saying he's going to lose. Well, we'll call this one in favor of, I don't know who the other person was. Do you? Were you? Australians might, but I don't. But anyway, it wasn't Murray Goot, I can tell you that. But you can see why they would go the other direction. An inquiry into the performance of the polls in 2019 found the errors were not the result of last-minute shifts in voter sentiment, nor of voters deliberately misleading pollsters, but that polls overestimated Labour's vote because their samples were unrepresentative and inadequately adjusted. So there is some kind of screen going on here. Most polls published by the news outlets rely on online survey-based polling online, with the exception of Roy Morgan and Ipsos, which also incorporate telephone interviews. And ham radio interviews from the olden days when they didn't have as many phone lines. Pollsters ask respondents about their voting intention and past voting patterns, as well as demographic and socioeconomic information. Many of these companies will pay respondents for completing an online-based survey. They get hot dogs, get paid for doing the surveys. This is terrific. They melted a lot of their guns. That's good. So if you're wondering if you've ever been polled by one of the newspapers, you should know. All right, that's a minor point. Also in the mix is so-called Robo Polling, more commonly used in seat and topic-specific polling from groups such as UComs. These are the phone calls that you get from a random number with an automated voice listing the voting options and asking which demographic categories you fall into. One industry source described this method as cheap and cheerful. Well, cheerful, that's nice. And yeah, I'm sure it's cheaper, and that's why they do it for the district-specific polling where the budgets are lower. That makes some sense. But you'd think they'd be more accurate in a mandatory voting situation. As the companies conducting this polling in 2019 relied on lists of voters' landline numbers, there were concerns that it skewed toward older respondents, and therefore the data did not accurately reflect the diversity of the voting pool. We have that problem. Social researcher Rebecca Huntley says one of the problems in 2019 was that the polling seemed to confirm what people already believed. All right, well, let me jump around. This is not only not American politics, it's not current, and there's so much other news. But I am kind of curious about this, so you're stuck with it. How have pollsters tried to fix it? In response to the 2019 failures, the Australian Polling Company, that is a terrific creative name, was established with major players adhering to a code of conduct and agreeing to make their methodologies public, which I think you kind of have to do just to be credible, with the exception of Resolve, whoever that is, which is not a member of the council. So, poo on them, I guess. National political polls published by newspapers have entirely moved away from Robo Polling, but otherwise the various companies have made different adjustments. Goot said there is now a very big spread in methodologies, particularly in how polls try to gauge voter intention. Peter Lewis, the executive director of Essential Media, which conducts polling published by Guardian Australia, that's this paper, agrees it's a whole lot less monolithic now. Example is of this differentiation is the way undecided voters are surveyed. Okay, that's still different. It doesn't seem to discuss whether or not they do any likely voter polling. Anyway, that's something maybe I should examine off the air at some point since I'm interested in it. Maybe you are too. I'd love to come back with an answer, but it doesn't deserve our second hour, at least in its entirety. All right. But, Greg, thank you for sending along some resources. At least it'll give us places to start and various sources I can look at. Let me look at the last thing you sent just to make sure the answer isn't in there. And I don't miss it. But maybe I can go looking for things here. Read this article, read about Murray Groot, see what he has to say. What's this here? Is this the grab from that paper? That must be it. Every major opinion poll failed to predict this. I think we read all of this. But yes, right. There was the quote from Rebecca Huntley, who said there was an accepted wisdom that the Labour Party was going to win, and it seemed to be confirmed by polling and the Liberal Party in disarray. But she says the problems with polling in other democracies eventually crept up on Australia. So I guess whatever those problems were, likely having a better picture of likely voters, or I was going to say likely voterism, it's kind of an ism, didn't appear to have much to do with it. And it didn't really matter whether you knew who your likely voters were or not. People were still having difficulty either answering the question, or maybe they just weren't responding, or maybe people who were going to secretly say, I don't know, I guess I'll just keep voting for the incumbent guy, hung up on the robo-pollers. Who knows? No answer there. So what can I tell you? Big waste of time. But that's political science for you. All right, let's see. There are definitely other stories. Time to switch directions. One story that came to my attention while we were already on the air with Greg, just thought I'd follow up, turn around, and go back on this one. I think we mentioned it at the time. U.S. officials say Ukraine was behind the car bomb that killed the daughter of that Russian nationalist. Remember a couple of weeks ago we were reading about this one? U.S. intelligence, this according to, well, I'm reading The Hill, but I guess they're gathering the news from other major papers like the New York Times. U.S. intelligence officials allege Ukraine was responsible for a car bomb that killed the daughter of a close ally of Vladimir Putin's. This, the Times reported yesterday while I was busy. Daria Dugina, the daughter of Russian nationalist Alexander Dugin, was killed in August when an explosive device, that's a bomb, planted under her Toyota Land Cruiser, that's a car, went off. American officials, it's interesting that they got the branding in there. American officials told the New York Times that U.S. intelligence believes parts of the Ukrainian government authorized the attack, though they did not specify whether Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky was aware of or had signed off on the attack. We don't know what the Ukrainian government structure is with regard to covert operations in wartime, so there's no telling whether that's an issue for them, a violation of anything, or maybe all's fair at this point. I don't know. The U.S. was not aware of the attack ahead of time and admonished Ukrainian officials over the killing, the American officials said. The lack of transparency about Ukraine's military and covert plans has reportedly led to frustration among U.S. officials, according to the New York Times. You know, just diplomatically speaking, yeah, you could see how it's the responsibility of American officialdom, I'm sure, to frown on car bombings across the spectrum, and then deny them if maybe we did them, whether this year or in previous years. I'm sure it's happened. That's the nature of the beast. All right. However, Russia's Federal Security Service accused Ukrainian secret services of killing the late in late August, blaming a Ukrainian named Natalia Voik. However, Ukraine denied the accusations. "We are not a criminal state, unlike Russia, and definitely not a terrorist state," Zelensky advisor Mikhailo Podolyak said. Dugina's father, a political thinker, sometimes known as Putin's brain. Where's Putin? Where's your brain? Well, he's walking around out there, and today he's at a funeral, I guess. Is suspected by some American officials to have been the intended target of the attack. The New York Times noted Dugin has been sanctioned by the U.S. since 2015. A television commentator, journalist, and chief editor of national outlet United World International, Dugina was also sanctioned by the U.S. in March. So, not a favorite of the U.S. or anything like that, but still, car bomb, and okay, it's a war. I don't know. I can't process it all right now. I just wanted to go back and say that I don't know what we thought about the likelihood of Ukrainian responsibility at the time, but that's the U.S. position now, even as we support Ukraine in their war effort. So that's a complicating factor, just like everything else. There's many aspects, many facets to every story and policy. Now, on to American politics again. Although we were involved in that one, we inserted ourselves into that story, as we usually do. Let's see. A couple of stories to note. How about a thematic story? I was looking at one of the latest efforts from Greg Sargent that was being circulated yesterday, and I think I saw, I'm always reluctant to retweet, was it Bill Kristol, but he's in his never Trump phase, and so he sometimes is quotable on these things, or maybe you want to just quote him just for saying, even the conservative Bill Kristol says. But he was using part of Greg Sargent's article to, he just quoted it and put it along with a link. Seemed to make an interesting and salient point, so I thought I'd read the article to you, the opinion piece, of course. Why Murdery Trader Green, he calls her by her proper name. By the way, we have maybe not mentioned on the show, not hugely relevant, but, always a interesting note. Marjorie Taylor Greene, divorcing her husband, which should come as no surprise. We've read on the air, they're not the closest, let's say, and we've read about the way she conducts her personal affairs, and it's highly questionable for a family values traditionalist Christian yada yada person. It's relevant, but question about whether does she hang on to the name, which is her thing, like she's even a 3-letter person, MTG, and people know what that's supposed to mean. I mean, now you and I know it means Murdery Trader Green, but does she drop the green and just be Murdery Trader again? Anyway, why Marjorie Taylor Greene, as she likes to call herself, is raging about the Biden regime. It's a rhetorical trick she uses, but Greg Sargent taking a critical look at it. No U.S. lawmaker rhapsodizes about political violence as enthusiastically as, why do I call her this, Murdery Trader Green? On Saturday, the Georgia Republican raged, Democrats want Republicans dead, and they've already started the killings. You heard that crazy quote from the other day. After the FBI search of Donald Trump's Mar-a-Lago resort, Green suggested the United States is embroiled in a civil war. Now, Green's flirtations with political violence have drawn scrutiny from the New York Times, which just published a new examination of violent political rhetoric. And I opened that up and put that away, too. Maybe we'll follow up with that. In the piece, Green's spokesman insists Green, who isn't going to be Green anymore maybe, is vehemently opposed to political violence, and that Democrats are the ones acting like a regime launching a war on their opposition. The The term regime is a mainstay of Green's political vocabulary, and right-wing authoritarian nationalists in Congress and the media are using it more and more prominently. Understanding the term is essential to grasping what's happening with today's MAGA-fied right, and why some experts fear we may be hurtling toward rising political violence and instability. Green is on the leading edge of this trend, and she's a chief source of instability because she's unstable. And after the Mar-a-Lago search, she suggested that only countries during a civil war typically see such rogue behavior by the state. Soon after, the term regime quickly became central to the right's Mar-a-Lago narrative as a way to express that thought. We were told that Trump is being victimized by regime apparatchiks, that the regime inflicted revenge on him, and that the regime was weaponizing the state against political opponents. By the way, the regime being the Biden regime, what revenge would they be inflicting on him? The regime, Biden, right? Biden won. What revenge is it that he has to take on Donald Trump? We don't know. It doesn't matter. It sounds good, so that's what they say. The Republican who ventured that last claim, the idea of weaponizing the state against political opponents, ironically enough, was Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, who is seeking disaster aid from this same regime, by the way, showing how this term has gone mainstream in the GOP. I thought the point he was going to make is nobody has politicized the state against their political opponents on the state level as extensively as Ron DeSantis has. But what would be the point of pointing out more Republican hypocrisy to this audience? You already know it. You were probably shouting that at the radio when I was saying it, which is ironic because this is on the computer. Your radio, poor radio, had nothing to do with it. It's telling that all the regime talk exploded after the Mar-a-Lago incident. After all, I mean, I think it predated it, but okay, maybe a greater explosion of it now. After all, the search was authorized by a judge who saw probable cause to believe that 3 federal statutes may have been violated. It ended up recovering reams of classified documents that Trump hoarded after his own lawyers suggested to investigators that none remained. His own lawyers signed at some point a legal document attesting that none remained. But anyway, to call this the work of the Biden regime is really to say that the act of applying the law to Trump will be treated as fundamentally illegitimate. When Green claims this is the stuff of civil wars and rogue regimes, she really means that holding Trump accountable to the law should be regarded by his supporters as an act of war. That's pretty incredible, and it's probably quite accurate, and that's the part that Bill Kristol was quoting. But just to put a finer point on that, or it's no finer, but just to reiterate, I guess, what they're saying, of course, is, to begin with, is it's rather outrageous to say, well, this is the stuff of civil war and rogue regimes. What do you mean? Due process and the warrant application process and establishment of probable cause, taking your case to a magistrate and getting a particularized warrant as the Constitution mandates, and then executing that warrant. And by the way, executing that warrant as gently as possible. This is the Espionage Act that's allegedly been violated here. And the search warrant comes at the end of what we now know to be a year-plus long process of trying even more gently to get the freaking national security crisis resolved through cooperation. And then when all else failed and they finally even went to the search warrant, they sent non-uniformed FBI personnel quietly without any major announcement to go do the search. And still they're complaining and whining and screaming about there's a civil war, rogue regime. It was as by the book as could possibly be. But okay. I mean, that doesn't mean that you can't dispute it by the book as well and go to court with it. It's just you keep losing in court, except from one crazy judge that keeps stretching the process out, but still can't quash the whole thing because there's still just too much legitimacy and momentum behind the actual search and seizure. Anyway, but then, of course, his point to also cast that as open call for, take your best shot, do what you got to do, because they're waging war on us, so maybe it's okay to wage war on them because a search warrant has been served. So I think an equal and opposite reaction would be beating up or running over protesters or murdering Democrats. Sure, go for it. Okay, that is problematic. Anyway, you also see this at work. What are we talking about? The rhetoric, I guess. When Green rages that the Biden regime is persecuting defendants in the January 6th attack on the Capitol, and when Green and others call them political prisoners. That, too, is another way to say that applying the law to Trump supporters who tried to violently disrupt his lawful Democratic replacement in office should also be regarded as an act of war. And you see it when Green seethes that Biden has declared every freedom-loving American an enemy of the state. That's a reference to Biden's speech slamming MAGA Republicans as a danger to democracy for campaigning on a vow to overturn future elections. That's an obviously correct assessment. But to Green and her Trump-supporting ilk, this wasn't just a speech. It was the state declaring war on them. And, I mean, no one here is inclined to believe her, and the people who are inclined to believe her won't be swayed by this either. But to the extent that there's anybody who says, well, maybe I should regard it differently, maybe I should be open to the possibility, I'll entertain it just as an intellectual exercise. Remember that you're taking the words here of someone who says, well, this is really ought to be legitimately considered a war on conservatives. Should it? Should it not? Let's examine the record. But before you do, I will just say that she also says that Jewish space lasers were used to start wildfires in California. So maybe you don't want to take everything she says quite that seriously. Now, in fairness, she'll say, I didn't say that. I said some other things, and I didn't know that the people who I accused of using their space lasers were Jewish. I mean, think about that, by the way, for just a second as an excuse. I didn't know they were Jewish. It was a big deal because there's, quite obvious anti-Semitism involved here. But if you forgive her that at some point, like, okay, let's say, for instance, that she thought white Anglo-Saxon Protestant space lasers had started the fires. Wouldn't we still have a big problem with the space laser thing? Like, there's no space lasers that anybody that I know of has gotten, certainly no religious denomination. But she didn't get a minor detail wrong. There were no space lasers starting fires. That's it. The anti-Semitism was a bonus from her perspective. So anyway, it's not like a person who's got one foot on the ground anywhere. That she thinks there's a civil war going on is like, well, of course she does. She thinks there's laser cannons in space. She doesn't know anything about what's happening in this world. So there you go. Take it with a gigantic boulder of salt and crush her underneath that boulder. There you go. Am I calling for civil war? No, I'm very pro-salt, and what do I know? I'm just saying she's not really working in reality. So, all right. But who am I talking to? You're not listening to her. All this opens the door to justifying extraordinary measures in response. And at bottom, the regime chatter is really central to that final move. And it's interesting because it does do double duty here. On the one hand, it justifies Republicans coming out and saying, well, then in that case, just to defend ourselves, and that's how they'll believe in it, we need to go out and murder Democrats, or whatever it is that their reaction is. And then, of course, it has the ancillary benefit for Green, who doesn't mind having her own people killed either, if it furthers the notion that she was actually correct in her lunacy. I mean, sometimes she gets points, or she thinks she'll get points, if Democrats say, oh my God, Republicans are getting ready to come out and kill us in defense of things that they think we're doing, maybe it is time to do that. Well, you can't, but then probably Democrats, because they think about things, say, well, you can't for a number of reasons, not the least of which is, well, then she'll be right. But, I mean, the more she talks like that, I will, I have this admission. The more she talks like that and the more I worry that she might actually motivate people to do it, the more I think, well, we may actually have to eventually prove her right. Like if they started, what would you do? If they actually started a civil war, what do you do? Not fight it because, well, we don't want murdery traitor Green to be right, so let's all die in the Civil War. And then afterwards, they'll all say, that was easier than I thought. Maybe we were wrong about that. There'll never be that reflection.
Hi, I'm Scott Anderson, the guy that writes the daily summary for this show, Kagro in the Morning. Thank you to everyone that supports this show. Many of you send donations through PayPal, Patreon, Square Cash, Radio Public, and so on. Some of you write your own essays and send them in, or read articles with your own commentary. We appreciate it. Now, some of you are listening to this and thinking, I'd like to help, but isn't there something I could do that wouldn't require money or effort? Why, yes, there is. You can just like us. On Daily Kos, they call it the recommend button. YouTube has a thumbs up. There are hearts and likes and love buttons. Tap our love button. Tap our love button every day. Share our shows and summaries on Facebook and Twitter, YouTube and iTunes, Stitcher and Amazon. Most of these places allow you to write a review, so a sentence or two would be great. Recommend us to social media, or tell your friends to listen to the show. You aren't just helping us, you're helping them find their new favorite thing to listen to. You could change the world. So thank you in advance from me and everybody else in the world.
All right, welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. It's getting a little concerning reading about the way murdery traitor Green incites people, but we do have to keep up on it. It's been suggested by many in the past and in the last couple of days as well that, she's doesn't deserve this much attention. She's a clown. We shouldn't give her this level of attention, deprive her of oxygen. I don't know. To me, that's like a discredited theory these days. And while it's true that if we all banded together and everybody agreed to ignore her, then she might be able to be, I don't know, whether she wouldn't necessarily go away, but maybe she would, in fact, be deprived of oxygen. But I don't know. I mean, they have their own oxygen-osphere, if you will. That would be known as an atmosphere, anyway. But so she could certainly survive a press boycott on the left, and it just seems like, to me, a discredited theory. They never seem to go away anymore. They don't need to be grounded in reality. They don't really need mainstream attention to survive. They just keep coming, and so maybe it's better to have some idea of what's out there, and I don't know. Be prepared in some way. What way? I don't know. Other than saying, well, they keep challenging us to a civil war, and we'll probably never accept their challenge until they actually begin it. Of course, they already think we began it, so they'll point at us as they begin it and say it was us. But, you're dealing with unbalanced people here, and a lot of them feel like this is a great idea, and eventually it will start. And just as we were saying the other day, that what the terminology being offered for what she was up to, accusation in a mirror, or every Republican accusation is a confession. I mean, the killings that have gone on, the political killings that have happened, or politically motivated killings, have pretty much all been them against their perceived enemies, and very rarely in the opposite direction, but it does happen. I guess the example that people would point to is the shootings at the congressional baseball game practice, the Republican practice, even though, quite honestly, it was kind of unclear exactly where that guy was coming from. But if you had to lay the blame somewhere or put them on the spectrum somewhere, apparently his manifesto included references to Bernie Sanders and others, Democrats or Democratic-leaning politicians. And so, therefore, what else are you going to take away from that? but, one might say, well, why even bother acknowledging it? Republicans would never acknowledge it. Well, that's true. Buys us nothing. But at any rate, I feel like you got to know what's coming, or keep an eye on it and discuss it. And I don't know what else, but I feel like I want forewarning, and maybe you do too. Anyway, where were we with this? In the article, we were just saying all this, that is her rhetoric, opens the door to justifying extraordinary measures in response. And at bottom, the regime chatter is really central to that final move. Conservatism scholar Joshua Tate explains how this works in his etymology of the regime term for the bulwark. I don't think I've read that one. The word, Tate notes, is meant to invoke a sense that a range of U.S. institutions, the administrative state, that reminds me of something else. But yeah, that was administrative state being Steve Bannon's preferred term. And it hasn't really caught on, although I think I did just see somewhere that some academic institution or another, at the behest undoubtedly of some conservative donor, had endowed a chair in the study of the administrative state. And it worried me a little bit. It might even have been George Mason where that was happening. But okay. The word, as Tate notes, regime, is meant to invoke a sense that a range of U.S. institutions, the administrative state, the media, universities, which now have studies in the administrative state, etc., have been irredeemably captured by the left, creating a, quote, regime that in some vague sense exercises hidden but tyrannical control, like Jewish space lasers. As Tate writes in this formulation, Trump is the tribune of the people, selectively defined, of course, who is waging a war on their behalf against this disguised tyranny. The regime has fought back with more oppression, which proves the truth of the original formulation in a conveniently self-reinforcing loop. What do people ultimately do to regimes? Tate asks rhetorically. They topple them. To call the legitimately elected Biden administration the regime, Tate argues, is an implicit call to overthrow it. Now, of course, I called it the Trump regime, and we did overthrow it by peaceful means, but then they tried to overthrow the overthrow by violent means, but they just didn't have their act together. But, of course, accusations being made in a mirror, this is somehow Biden's fault and the fault of the left and its regime. But yeah, ultimately people do topple regimes, which is, I guess, why with Trump considering a run again in 2024 and by all appearances, people in the swing states preparing to allow that regime to be draped in what looks like legitimacy but won't really look all that legitimate, because we have been talking about the mechanics that they'll be using to reinstall Trump. Well, that puts him back in a position to fulfill my own prediction about his ultimate fate, that he would eventually be Ceausescu'd out of this planet. But that probably depends on his... I don't want to be right for a number of reasons, not the least of which is I don't really want to see political violence reach that level in the United States ever again, or anywhere for that matter, but... This is the one that's in my control and it is closest to home for me. But I don't need to be proven right, because that would mean like re-electing him. Although they could execute him by firing squad even if he loses later on. And it's getting to the point where I'd be fine with that. He's just that much trouble in the world. And, sometimes I guess you give in to those impulses. I wouldn't recommend it. It'll ruin your life, not to mention his, but okay. Anyway, I just, since we're talking about how regimes fall, thought I would throw out that inevitability, I think. I mean, toppling regimes, that's euphemistic, right? What do people ultimately do to regimes? They topple them. What does toppling mean? And generally speaking, when you're talking about regimes, you're talking about more or less totalitarian dictatorship. So they don't topple them by voting. They topple them by threatening the death of, the top names of the regime, who either suffer that death or flee. So we should be clear about that. Stephen Levitsky, a scholar of democratic breakdown, sees this as roughly analogous to Latin American countries in which the concerted delegitimization of elected governments was followed by coups. Again, leaving aside for the moment that a lot of that was, I don't know, very often CIA-driven delegitimization of elected governments, followed by CIA-legitimized coups. So, anyway, to call a democratically elected government a regime is to deliberately undermine its legitimacy and justify authoritarian and violent acts against it, Levitsky tells me. By the way, before I get too far off of that aside that I made, yeah, all of that is true about the U.S. and the CIA being bad actors historically in Latin America in particular. And you might say, well, is this any time to be doing the blame America first thing? Well, that's a conservative trope about liberal Americans. So one, we reject that. And two, honestly, if your takeaway from the America's history in Latin America is we should do that here, then yeah, you might have the wrong idea about history and you may have missed the point there. So I don't mind sticking by that assessment. The mainstreaming of the term among Republicans bodes badly for what's to come, Levitsky warns. This comes after a large swath of Republicans went all in with Trump's efforts to overturn the 2020 election and then with placing him beyond accountability for the mob's coup attempt and for everything else, and as political violence is increasingly glorified in GOP politics. Now the term regime is being employed strategically to justify the further abandonment of democracy. Levitsky notes, this is clear evidence that a big sector of the party is now on authoritarian terrain. Okay, very interesting, very true. Lots of good links in here too. One of them was to something else that I decided to put in pocket. Sounded important. The New York Times article that he references here. After Mar-a-Lago search, talk of civil war is flaring online. Better check in on this. The Times here, represented by Ken Bensinger and Shira Frankel, who report from yesterday. Soon after the FBI searched Donald Trump's home in Florida for classified documents, online researchers zeroed in on a worrying trend. Posts on Twitter that mentioned, quote, civil war had soared nearly 3,000% in just a few hours as Mr. Trump's supporters blasted the action as a provocation. Similar spikes followed, including on Facebook, Reddit, Telegram, Parler, Gab, and Truth Social, Mr. Trump's own social media platform. By the way, there probably should be some investigation to how much of that is bots and how much of that might be Russian bots. This would be perfect for, I don't know, but this would be a perfect topic for them. They could, that's exactly what they would love to rush forward with. And they'd love to see, for a number of reasons, the U.S. fall into civil war. Then we'd be too distracted to bother with what they're doing elsewhere. And hell, I mean, if they were able to actually manipulate the American elections process such that we, at least temporarily, elected one of their puppets, then surely they would love to play in a civil war. They could just win us outright. Well, at any rate, that's something to think about. But that would be an easy exploit for them, even if they had no intention of intervening in such a civil war. Let's see. We got all of that. Posts mentioning civil war jumped again a few weeks later after President Biden branded Mr. Trump and MAGA Republicans a threat to the very foundations of our republic in a speech on democracy in Philadelphia. I mean, they'll blame that, but what else do you say about, well, there's been a 3,000% spike in mentions of civil war by Trump and MAGA Republicans as a result of the search. That's bad. We shouldn't have that. Oh, yeah, well, that's even more civil war. Well, okay. I mean, you just don't stand by and not say anything. Now experts are bracing for renewed discussions of civil war as the November 8th midterm elections approach and political talk grows more urgent and heated. More than a century and a half after the actual Civil War, the deadliest war in U.S. history, by the way, death toll far surpassed now by COVID, Civil War references may have become increasingly commonplace on the right, While in many cases the term is used only loosely, shorthand for the nation's intensifying partisan divisions, observers note that the phrase, for some, is far more than a metaphor. And we should also note, by the way, it's not brand new, and plenty of people showed up on January 6th with pre-printed T-shirts and signs calling this the first shot, or maybe even the 10th or 15th shot in the Civil War. And this was all about Civil War. And this was supposed to be the official start of it. The event that was clearly enough a break with the past that this would be deemed the official start of the Second Civil War. Polling, social media studies, and a rise in threats suggest that a growing number of Americans are anticipating or even welcoming the possibility of sustained political violence, researchers studying extremism say. What was once the subject of serious discussion only on the political periphery has migrated closer to the mainstream. But while that trend is clear, there is far less agreement among experts about what it means. Some elements of the far right view it literally, a call for an organized battle for control of the government. Others envision something akin to a drawn-out insurgency punctuated with eruptions of political violence, such as the attacks on the FBI's Cincinnati field office in August. A third group, I would maybe more like the bombing of the Alfred Murrah Federal Building in Oklahoma City way back when. A third group describes the country as entering a cold civil war, manifested by intractable polarization and mistrust, rather than a hot war with conflicts. The question is, what does civil war look like and what does it mean, said Elizabeth Newman, Assistant Secretary for Counterterrorism at the Homeland Security Department under Mr. Trump. I did not anticipate, nor did anyone else as far as I know, how rapidly the violence would escalate. Mrs. Newman now works for Moonshot, a private security company, course, that tracks extremism online. Moonshot found a 51% increase in Civil War references on the most active pages of 4chan, the fringe online message board, in the week after Mr. Biden's September 1st speech. But talk of political violence is not relegated to anonymous online forums. At a Trump rally in Michigan on Saturday night, Representative Murdery Trader Green, a Republican from Georgia, said that Democrats want Republicans dead, adding that Joe Biden has declared every freedom-loving American an enemy of the state. At a recent fundraiser, Mike Flynn, the notorious spy, who briefly served as Mr. Trump's national security advisor, which is a problem, said that governors had the power to declare war, and that we're probably going to see that. They don't, and I hope we won't. On Monday, federal prosecutors showed a jury in Washington an encrypted message that Stuart Rhodes, founder of the Oath Keepers armed extremist group, that's a good way of putting it instead of saying militia, that's nice, had sent his lieutenants 2 days after the 2020 presidential election, quote, "We aren't getting through this without a civil war." Experts say the steady patter of bellicose talk has helped normalize the expectation of political violence. Maybe that's a new argument for not discussing Murdery Trader Green all the time, or normalizing discussion of political violence. In late August, a poll of 1,500 adults by YouGov and The Economist found that 54% of respondents who identified as strongly strong Republicans, believed the Civil War was at least somewhat likely in the next decade. Only about a third of all respondents felt such an event was unlikely. A similar survey conducted by the same groups 2 years ago found nearly 3 in 5 people feeling that a Civil War-like fracture in the U.S. was either somewhat or very unlikely. What you're seeing is a narrative that was limited to the fringe going into the mainstream, said Robert Pape, a political science professor at the University of Chicago and founder of the Chicago Project on Security and Threats. The Institute's researchers tracked tweets mentioning civil war before and after Mr. Trump announced the search on Mar-a-Lago. In the 5 preceding days, they logged an average of roughly 500 tweets an hour. That jumped to 6,000 in the first hour after Mr. Trump published a post on Truth Social on the afternoon of August 8th saying, "These are dark times." He would say, These are dark times for our nation, and you know I hate dark things. Anyway, he didn't say that second part, but you know he meant it. The pace peaked at 15,000 tweets an hour later that evening. A week later, it was still 6 times higher than the baseline, and the phrase was once again trending on Twitter at month's end. Extremist groups have been agitating for some sort of government overthrow for years, and Mr. Pape said the most radical views, often driven by white supremacy or religious fundamentalism, remain marginal, advanced by no more than 50,000 people nationwide. But a far larger group, he said, are the people who have been influenced by Trump's complaints about the Washington swamp and deep state forces working against him and his allies. Those notions, stirred in a smoldering crucible with QAnon conspiracy theories, anti-vaccine views, and election denialism, have fueled a growing hostility toward the federal government and rising talk about states' rights. Did you know that a governor can declare war? Mr. Flynn said at the fundraiser on September 18th for Mark Finchem, a Republican running for Secretary of State in Arizona. And we are probably going to see that. I mean, I guess a governor can declare anything he wants. It's just a question of whether anybody believes him. Neither Mr. Flynn nor Mr. Finchem responded to a request for comment about the inaccurate remarks, since they don't actually have that power. The U.S. Constitution, we're going to fact check this, grants Congress the sole power to declare war. It does say that, too, sole power. And in fact, specifically bars states from engaging in war unless actually invaded. But that just makes them say, all right, well, they've been invaded either by immigrants, that becomes an invasion, or Democrats. Democrats invaded. They voted. It's an invasion. They'll just call anything they want an invasion, if they care at all about that phrase in the Constitution. However far-fetched, such ideas are often amplified by a proliferating set of social media channels, such as the right-wing platform Gab and Trump's Truth Social. Social media platforms were rife with groups and boards dedicated to discussions of civil war. One, on Gab, describes itself as a place for, quote, action reports, combat vids, and reports of people killed in action in the Civil War that is also looking to be a second American Revolution. That way it's not just like, if it's just the Civil War, then it was like, well, we had one of those and you guys lost. Well, okay, in that case, we claim the mantle of a second American Revolution. And in that one, we won because we say we're patriots, and the patriots won. Well, other people said you weren't patriots. Social media platforms are rife with, we just did this one. In August, a single tweet stating, I think civil war has just been declared, managed to reach over 17 million profiles despite coming from an account with under 14,000 followers, according to Cybara, an Israeli firm that monitors misinformation. And they probably also monitor bots, and that's probably how that one happened. Ideas go into echo chambers, and it's the only voice that's heard. There are no voices of dissent, said Kurt Braddock, an American university professor who studies how terrorist groups radicalize and recruit. Mr. Braddock said he did not believe these posts indicated any planning for a war, but he worries about what academics call stochastic terrorism, seemingly random acts of violence that are in fact provoked by coded language, dog whistles, and other subtext in statements by public figures. Mr. Trump is adept at making such statements, said Mr. Braddock, citing Trump's April 2020 tweet reading, Liberate Michigan. Less than 2 weeks later, mobs of heavily armed protesters occupied the state capitol in Lansing. He also pointed to Mr. Trump's speech before the Capitol riot on January 6, 2021, when he encouraged thousands of supporters to march to the U.S. Capitol, and later, in the same remarks, told them, if you don't fight like hell, you're not going to have a country anymore. The statements Trump makes are not overt calls to action, although he did say walk down there, and that's setting them on foot. Please, somebody charge him with that. But when you have a huge and devoted following, the chances that one or more people are activated by that are high, Braddock said. A spokesman for Mr. Trump did not respond to requests for comment, and that's really all it takes. I mean, if you assemble people in a crowd in particular, one even errant gunshot, an accidental gunshot, like a gun fail, right, can trigger the whole thing. If you have an armed mob and they're face to face with somebody that they believe is the enemy and worth killing, and then a gunshot goes off, even if it's one of your own people accidentally shooting themselves in the foot or the face or anything like that, And sometimes it's calculated. I'm just going to fire a shot, and then everybody's going to say, shots fired, and then everyone will start shooting, and then it'll be like, oh, if you don't start shooting, you're just going to get killed on both sides. And they know that, and that might be part of the plan. Anyway, Trump himself used the term civil war in 2019 when he declared in a tweet that it will cause a civil war-like fracture in this nation from which our country will never heal if he was removed from office. Well, then he wasn't removed from office, and then he's like, well, something else will cause the civil war. Keep that in mind. Like, they keep pressing for it no matter what happens. If I'm removed from office, there'll be a civil war. Okay, fine, you scared us. We won't remove you from office. Well, if I don't get 2 Big Macs for free every day, there'll be a civil war. Could be anything. Can't keep appeasing him. Last month, Mr. Trump said there would be, quote, problems in this country, the likes of which perhaps we've never seen before, if he was indicted over his handling of the classified documents that were the target of the FBI search. Other Republicans have used language suggesting the country is on the brink. Ms. Green, who may or may not be green anymore, wrote in August that the Mar-a-Lago search reflected the, quote, type of things that happen in countries during civil war. Really not, because what tends to break down in the middle of civil war is the judicial process, but okay. But she's an ahistorical moron. Does it represent the type of thing that happens, that there are Jewish space lasers? No, those are not things that happen. Not even Christian space lasers. There's really, dare I say, honestly, no space lasers. We really kind of haven't. I mean, who knows what we've tried to build in the past. But, didn't we kind of rule that out as a logical possibility at some point? Okay. Anyway, this, according to her, is the type of thing that happens during Civil War. In posts to her nearly 900,000 combined followers on Facebook and Telegram, Senator Rick Scott of Florida likened the FBI to the Gestapo, which they helpfully explain are the secret police in Nazi Germany, in case you missed that chapter of American history, world history, saying this cannot be our country. Late last month, Senator Ted Cruz, a Republican, told the Texas Tribune he believed immigration legislation was unlikely in part because of a political civil war. He has made similar comments before, including a November 2021 call for Texas to secede if Democrats, quote, destroy the country. And he'll point to I said political civil war. Yeah, well, what was the first civil war? It was political too. And then, of course, why not invoke secession just to make sure that everybody knows you mean something different from the first Civil War, right? Nick Dyer, a spokesman for Ms. Green, said that she was, quote, vehemently opposed to political violence. She just likes civil wars. And that her Civil War comments were about Democrats who are acting like a regime, launching a war on their opposition. We're just the victims in all this. McKinley Lewis, communications director for Mr. Scott, said he had, quote, zero, in capitals, tolerance for violence of any kind, but added that he continues to demand answers related to the FBI's Mar-a-Lago search, to which you're not entitled. But anyway, Republicans have often argued that their language is political rhetoric and blamed Democrats for twisting it to stoke divisions. It's Democrats on the left, they said, who are courting violence by labeling Mr. Trump's supporters adherents of what Mr. Biden has called a semi-fascism. In response to a query about Mr. Cruz's comments, Maria Jeffrey Reynolds, a spokeswoman for the senator, said Mr. Cruz placed blame on President Biden, claiming that he has, quote, driven a wedge down the middle of our country. After President Biden delivered a speech on democracy, Brian Gibby, a freelance data entry specialist in Charlotte, North Carolina, wrote in a Substack post that he believed the Second Civil War began with the president's remarks. I have never seen a more divisive, hate-filled speech from an American president, Mr. Gibby wrote, and then he went out and bought a television, I guess. Asked by the New York Times to explain his views, Mr. Gibby said he believed Mr. Biden was escalating a hot conflict in America, of which there really isn't one, including the lasers. He worries something will happen around the November elections that he will be akin to January 6th, but much more violent, where armed protest groups from both sides of the political spectrum come to blows. Plan ahead, stock up, wink, wink, stay safe, get out of cities if you can, he wrote. And obviously he's a visionary because his post on Twitter was widely shared. I mean, I guess you got to go to the source and ask what the hell you meant by that. But, oh, by the way, it's illustrated by an interesting photo, a wider angle photo of Biden giving that speech in Philadelphia. And do you remember the big complaint Trump and others made it? They used a red background that's supposed to, mean something in some way. Or interesting that the wider shot shows the middle of, was it Independence Hall that he was giving the speech in front of? The middle of the building illuminated in red. The wings of the building are illuminated in blue. There's a not quite red, white, and blue motif here, but more to it than just red. But remember, it was all red. It was supposed to mean something in particular, a signal for a civil war, except for the parts of it that weren't red. But okay. Just thought I'd point that out. Anyway, time for us to gather our things and get the hell out of here and give space to Justice Putnam and the West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy, bringing you all those other stories, those juicy stories that we didn't allow time for today. Let's see what he's got on tap. Why not? A comprehensive report found a whopping 3,000% increase in violent Civil War online rhetoric just before midterms. I knew that had to be part of his report. Plus more, a motorcade taking Vice President Harris to work was in a one-car accident, but agents misled the Secret Service director on the true nature of the incident. What might that be?
NetworksRadio.com. You have been listening to Kagro in the Morning with David Waldman.
There's more, of course. A former Uber security chief has been convicted of covering up a 2016 data breach, and the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals has put dreamers' lives in limbo again. Let's find out more on details on that. Yes, probably should have paid more closer attention to that, but thank God there's justice. Stay tuned.